Summer of 1924. A mountain man stood in front of a crowd with a 10-day-old baby in his arms. He had two choices: let them take her into the system, or trust a stranger with his darkest secret. He chose the stranger, and that choice changed 3 lives forever. The Harlow County Fairgrounds baked under the West Virginia sun like a skillet left too long on the fire. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to choke on, while the auctioneer's voice cut through the humid afternoon with the practiced rhythm of a man who'd sold everything from livestock to lost dreams. Tobias McCoy stood beside a cardboard crib that had no business being there. His weathered hands cradled a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, gentle despite the calluses earned from 47 years of mountain living. The baby in his arms weighed less than a sack of flour, but she carried the weight of every mistake he'd ever made. Around him, the remnants of 3 generations lay scattered across weathered tables. His father's hunting rifle, his grandfather's logging tools, the family Bible with names written in ink that had faded to the color of old blood. Everything the McCoy family had built since 1844, reduced to lot numbers and opening bids. The crowd kept their distance. Mountain folk knew trouble when they saw it, and a man standing at an auction with a newborn baby was trouble of the worst kind. Tobias had tried explaining. The baby wasn't property to be sold, he'd said. She was his niece, orphaned when her parents died in an accident just weeks ago. He was her only family, her legal guardian, and he'd fight any man who tried to separate them. But the law saw it differently. The creditors had taken everything: his family's 80 acres of prime timberland, his brother Jonah's pickup truck, even the rights to raise this child, because a homeless man with no income and no prospects couldn't provide adequate care for an infant. So here he stood, his back straight, despite the shame burning in his chest, his arms tight around the only thing in this world he had left to lose. The auctioneer climbed onto his platform, mopping sweat from his bald head with a handkerchief that had seen cleaner days. He surveyed the crowd with the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Lot 47, he called out, his voice carrying across the fairgrounds. "McCoy family homestead contents, including temporary guardianship responsibilities for 1 female infant, aged 10 days. The words hung in the humid air like a curse. Tobias felt every eye turned toward him, saw the pity, saw the judgment, saw good people look away, because watching a man lose everything was the kind of spectacle that made you feel dirty just for witnessing it. The baby stirred in his arms, tiny fingers curling against the edge of the receiving blanket. She had her mother's dark hair and the beginnings of what would be Cherokee features, though nobody in this crowd knew that truth. Nobody knew that this child was more his than anyone could imagine. "Do I hear an opening bid?" The auctioneer's voice had lost its enthusiasm. Even he understood the wrongness of what was happening here. Silence. Tobias looked down at the baby's face. Lily Rose, they'd named her. Born into a world that didn't want her, because the accident had taken both her parents before she drew her first breath. Born into a world that didn't want her, because her father had been drunk behind the wheel, and her mother had been 8 months pregnant, and neither of them had survived long enough to see her take her first breath. Born because Tobias McCoy had committed a sin he'd carry to his grave. "Going once," the auctioneer said, half-hearted. Tobias closed his eyes. In his mind, he could still see Naomi Clearwater the day Jonah brought her home, could see the fear in her eyes when his brother came home drunk and angry, could remember the 3 times he'd failed to be the man he should have been, the 3 times he'd let loneliness and her desperation lead them both down a path that ended here, at this auction, with this innocent child paying the price. "Going twice." The baby made a soft sound, somewhere between a coo and a whimper. Tobias opened his eyes and whispered to her, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. "I'm sorry, little darling. I tried." The auctioneer raised his gavel, and then a voice cut through the silence, clear as church bells on Sunday morning. $300. Every head turned. Grace Ellen Thornton stood at the edge of the crowd, one hand raised, the other pressed against the small swell of her belly that 4 months of pregnancy had created. At 38, she'd thought her chance for family had died with Thomas. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, and her brown hair was already escaping from the pins that tried to hold it in place. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her hand trembled slightly as she kept it raised. But her eyes were steady. The auctioneer blinked. "Ma'am, do you understand what you're bidding on?" "I understand perfectly," Grace said, her voice carrying despite its softness. $300 for the lot, including the child. Tobias stared at her. He'd seen her before, of course. Everyone in Harlow Springs knew the librarian widow who'd moved into her grandmother's old farmhouse after her husband died. Quiet woman, kept to herself. Pregnant with a dead man's baby through some new medical procedure the doctors were trying. Folks said she was brave. Folks said she was foolish. Folks said a lot of things about Grace Thornton. But nobody had ever called her crazy until now. "Sold," the auctioneer said quickly, before anyone could object or the woman could come to her senses. "To Mrs. Thornton for $300. The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like thunder. Grace made her way through the crowd, which parted for her like the Red Sea for Moses. Up close, Tobias could see the fine lines around her eyes that grief had carved, and the determined set of her jaw that said she'd made up her mind, and heaven help anyone who tried to change it. "I have my car over there," she said, gesturing toward a Ford Model T that looked almost as tired as Tobias felt. "Can you carry her, or should I?" Tobias found his voice, rough from disuse and shock. "Ma'am, you don't know what you just did." "I know exactly what I did," Grace said. "I bought a man and a baby who needed help. Now, are we going to stand here in this heat, or are we going to get that child somewhere cool?" 20 minutes later, Tobias found himself folded into the passenger seat of Grace Thornton's car, his knees nearly touching his chest because the seat wouldn't go back far enough to accommodate his 6'2" frame. In the back, Lily slept in a basket they'd fashioned from towels and Grace's purse strap, secured as best they could manage with what they had. Grace drove with the careful concentration of someone who'd learned late in life, her hands tight on the wheel as they navigated the dirt roads that led out of town. The car rattled and groaned, but it moved, and that was more than Tobias had any right to hope for. "Name's Tobias McCoy," he said finally, because the silence was becoming uncomfortable. "Folks call me Toby." "Grace Thornton," she replied, not taking her eyes off the road. "And I know who you are. Your brother Jonah used to come into the library sometimes, back when he was courting Naomi. Sweet girl. I was sorry to hear about the accident." Tobias looked out the window at the passing trees. "Appreciate that." More silence. Then Grace spoke again, her voice softer. "When did you last eat something hot?" The question caught him off guard. Tobias tried to remember. The day before the auction? The day before that? Time had become slippery since Jonah and Naomi died, measured only in Lily's feeding schedule and the growing panic about what would happen when the foreclosure came through. "Day before yesterday," he admitted. Maybe the day before that. Grace's hands tightened on the wheel. Then you're both staying for dinner. And tonight, I have space. Ma'am, I can't impose like that. It's not an imposition, Grace said firmly. That baby needs a safe place to sleep, and you need a hot meal and a night's rest. Everything else we'll figure out tomorrow. The farmhouse came into view as they crested a small hill. White, two-story, with green shutters, surrounded by 20 acres of mostly unused pasture. Not grand, but solid. The kind of place that had weathered generations and would weather more. Grace pulled into the gravel driveway and cut the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Why?" Tobias asked. "Why'd you do it?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, her hands still on the wheel, even though the car was silent. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. "My husband Thomas died of tuberculosis 14 months ago. We tried for 10 years to have a baby. Every treatment, every doctor, every prayer. Nothing worked." She touched her belly gently. "This child is from a new procedure they're trying. In vitro fertilization. They harvested what they needed from Thomas before he died, and 3 months after his funeral, they called to tell me the implantation was successful." She turned to look at Tobias directly, for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. "I was going to raise this baby alone, in a house too big for 2 people. Then I saw you standing there with Lily, and I thought maybe God was giving me a chance to do something right. To build the family Thomas and I never got to have." Tobias felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen since the day he'd held Lily for the first time and realized what his choices had cost. "I need you to know," he said carefully. "I'm good for that $300. I'll work it off, every penny." Grace smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to something approaching beautiful. "I'll hold you to that, Toby McCoy. Now let's get that baby inside before this heat gets any worse." The house smelled like lavender and lemon oil, clean in a way that spoke of someone who found comfort in order. Grace led him to the living room, where mismatched furniture created a space that felt lived in rather than decorated. A recliner that had clearly belonged to her late husband, a couch inherited from family, built-in bookshelves lined with novels and gardening magazines. On the mantel, photographs told the story Grace's words had sketched. A wedding picture from 15 years ago, both bride and groom young and full of hope. And beside it, a hospital photograph that must have been taken near the end. Thomas Thornton, thin but smiling, his wife's hand clasped in his. Tobias stood in the doorway, suddenly aware of how out of place he was. His clothes dusty from the auction, his beard untrimmed, his hands rough and stained from work that no longer existed. He was a mountain man standing in a lady's parlor, and the contrast felt almost obscene. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Taking in strangers, I mean. World's full of people who'd take advantage of kindness like yours." Grace settled into a chair near the window, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly in a gesture Tobias had seen Naomi make 1,000 times. "I'm not sure about anything these days," she admitted. "But that baby needs a safe place to sleep, and you both looked like you could use a meal. Everything else, we'll figure out as we go." While Grace heated chicken casserole in the kitchen, Tobias sat on the couch with Lily cradled against his chest. The baby was starting to wake, making the soft mewing sounds that meant she'd be hungry soon. He'd gotten good at reading her signals over the past 10 days, good at testing bottle temperature on his wrist, at supporting her head just right, at knowing the difference between a tired cry and a hungry one. He'd had to learn fast. There'd been no one else to teach him. Grace returned with a plate of food and a glass of sweet tea. She set them on the coffee table, then settled back into her chair to watch him eat. Tobias tried to pace himself, tried not to wolf down the first hot meal he'd had in days. But his body had other ideas. The food disappeared faster than he'd intended. "You want to tell me what really happened?" Grace asked gently. "With your brother and Naomi?" Tobias set down his fork. This was the moment where he could tell the truth and watch her throw him out, or keep lying and let the deception grow roots. He chose a middle path. "Jonah had problems," he said slowly. "Drinking, mostly. Bootleg whiskey from the stills up in the hollers. When Naomi got pregnant, he got worse instead of better. Started staying out late. Started saying things he shouldn't say. Naomi was scared." All true as far as it went. "I tried to help," Tobias continued. "Fix things around their cabin. Brought food when money was tight. Tried to talk sense into Jonah when he was sober enough to listen." Also true. "The accident happened 6 weeks ago. Jonah was driving Naomi to a doctor's appointment. She was 8 months along. A drunk driver ran a red light downtown." This was the lie, the convenient fiction that kept the real truth buried where it belonged. They airlifted Naomi to the hospital in Dallas. Doctors managed to save the baby, but Naomi held on just long enough to see Lily born. Jonah never woke up. They died within 2 days of each other. Grace's eyes glistened with tears. "I'm so sorry." Tobias looked down at Lily, who was starting to fuss in earnest now. "Hospital released her to me, being I'm the only family left. But the medical bills wiped out what little savings we had. When I couldn't make the mortgage payments, the bank started foreclosure. Gentry Timber made an offer on the land. Low offer, but legal. And once the house was gone, child welfare said I couldn't provide adequate housing. So they put custody up for auction," Grace finished, anger creeping into her voice. "Not officially. But everyone at that auction knew the score. Whoever bought the household goods would also be taking responsibility for a baby with no legal protections." Tobias met her eyes. "I couldn't let her go into the foster system. Too many kids get lost that way." Grace stood and held out her arms. "Let me take her while you get her bottle ready. Kitchen's through there. Formula and bottles are in the bag you brought." They worked together with the awkward efficiency of strangers learning a dance. Tobias prepared the bottle while Grace walked the floor with Lily, humming something soft and wordless. When he tested the temperature and brought it back, Grace had already settled into the rocking chair, the baby positioned perfectly for feeding. "You're good at this," Tobias observed. "I taught elementary school before I became a librarian," Grace said. "You learn a few things about children in that line of work." She fed Lily with practiced competence while Tobias cleaned up the kitchen, needing to do something useful, needing to feel like less of a charity case. Through the doorway, he could see them together, the widow and the orphan, both of them carrying grief, both of them reaching for something that looked like hope. When Lily was fed and burped and sleeping again, Grace showed Tobias to the upstairs guest room. A crib stood in the corner, left over from some previous visit by family with children. Fresh sheets on the bed, clean towels on the dresser. The kind of preparations that spoke of a woman who knew how to care for people. "Bathrooms across the hall," Grace said. "There's extra blankets in the closet if you need them. And Toby?" He turned to look at her. "Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. Job hunting, legal paperwork, whatever needs doing. But tonight, you and Lily are safe. Try to remember what that feels like." After she left, Tobias stood in the middle of the room, holding Lily, looking around at a space cleaner and safer than anywhere he'd lived in months. The baby slept against his chest, her breath warm and steady, her tiny hand curled against his collarbone. He thought about Grace Thornton's question. What did safety feel like? He'd forgotten. Downstairs, Grace sat in her late husband's recliner, staring at nothing. The house felt different with people in it, felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. She could hear Tobias moving around upstairs, the creak of floorboards as he settled Lily into the crib, the sound of water running in the bathroom. She'd done something completely insane today. Spent $300 she couldn't really afford on a man she didn't know and a baby that wasn't hers. Brought them into her home without references or background checks, or any of the sensible precautions a widow living alone should take. Her late husband would have thought she'd lost her mind, but he also would have been proud of her courage. Grace closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like. A house with children's laughter, a table set for more than one, someone to share the load of daily living, someone to talk to over morning coffee, someone to build a future with instead of constantly looking back at the past. It was a dangerous thought, the kind that led to disappointment. But as Lily's soft coos drifted down through the old floorboards, mixing with the sound of Tobias singing something low and wordless, Grace let herself hope anyway. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Tobias woke before dawn, tried to stay quiet, failed because Lily had her own schedule. Grace would find them in the kitchen, Tobias preparing bottles with the careful attention of a man who'd learned through necessity, Lily watching him with those dark eyes that were starting to focus on faces. They'd eat breakfast together, talk about small things, weather and repairs that needed doing around the farmhouse, Grace's work at the library, the job interview Wade Morrison had set up for Tobias at Double Creek Ranch. It felt like playing house, like pretending at something neither of them had any right to claim. On the morning of the 4th day, that pretense shattered. The white sedan with state plates pulled into the driveway at 9 in the morning, just as Grace was getting ready to leave for work. Tobias was outside, fixing the stuck front door, shirtless in the summer heat, his muscled back gleaming with honest sweat. He stopped hammering when he saw the car. Grace recognized trouble when she saw it. The woman who emerged wore a navy suit despite the heat, and carried a clipboard like a weapon. Behind her, a sheriff's deputy stood with his hand resting casually on his belt, the gesture somehow both reassuring and threatening. "Mrs. Thornton," the woman said, her professional smile not reaching her eyes. "I'm Karen Bishop from Child Protective Services. This is Deputy Martinez. We need to speak with you about the minor child currently in your care." Grace's mouth went dry, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course. Please come in." The living room that had felt cozy suddenly felt too small. Karen Bishop's eyes cataloged everything. The makeshift changing station on the coffee table, the formula bottles drying in the dish rack, the baby sleeping peacefully in her crib near the window. "Mr. McCoy," Karen said, consulting her clipboard, "I need to inform you that the temporary guardianship arrangement made at the hospital is under review. The circumstances of the auction have raised concerns about the child's welfare and your ability to provide stable care." Tobias's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Lily's been well cared for. She's got a roof over her head, regular feedings, everything she needs. What more concerns are there?" "The auction, for starters." Karen pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "Auctioning a person, even indirectly, violates several state statutes. The fact that you participated in such an arrangement raises questions about your judgment." "Nobody was being auctioned," Tobias said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. Lily stirred in response to his tension. "I was trying to keep us together when everything else was being taken away." Nevertheless, the situation was irregular, and Mrs. Thornton, Karen turned her attention to Grace. "While your intentions may have been charitable, you're not licensed as a foster care provider. Technically, this child is in an unauthorized placement." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I wasn't aware that helping someone in need required a license." "When it involves the care of a minor child, yes, it does." Karen's tone softened slightly. "Look, I can see this is a loving environment. The baby appears healthy. But we have protocols for a reason." Deputy Martinez spoke for the first time. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Bishop?" "Immediate, temporary removal of the child to licensed foster care while we complete a full assessment of Mr. McCoy's fitness as a guardian. He'll be allowed supervised visits while we determine the best permanent placement." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Tobias went very still, his arms instinctively moving toward the crib. "You want to take her away from the only family she has left?" he said quietly. "Mr. McCoy, you've experienced a significant financial and housing crisis. You have no fixed address, no steady employment, and no support system in place. A newborn requires stability." "She has stability here," Tobias interrupted. "She's got people who love her, a safe place to sleep, everything she needs." "But it's not a legal arrangement," Karen said. "Mrs. Thornton could change her mind at any time, and you'd both be homeless again. The child needs protection from that uncertainty." Grace found her voice. "What if I became a licensed foster parent? Would that change things?" Karen consulted her papers. "The process takes time. Background checks, home studies, training requirements. We're talking weeks, possibly months. So in the meantime, you'd separate a baby from the only parent she's ever known." Grace couldn't keep the anger from her voice. "How is that in her best interest?" "Mrs. Thornton, I understand your concern, but I have a duty to protect vulnerable children from unstable situations." "This situation isn't unstable." Grace stood, her hand moving protectively to her own growing child. "This baby lost both parents before she was a week old. The only constant in her life has been Toby. You want to traumatize her further by putting her with strangers?" Tobias looked up at her with something like wonder, as if he hadn't expected her to fight for them. Karen's professional mask slipped slightly. "I'm not the villain here. I've seen what happens when good intentions aren't backed up by proper procedures. Children get hurt." "So you prevent hurt by tearing us apart first?" Tobias's voice was quiet but intense. "Lily knows my voice, my touch. She settles when I hold her. You take her away and put her with strangers. You tell me how that helps her." Deputy Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Bishop, what if we could arrange some kind of temporary supervised situation? Give folks time to get the paperwork sorted, without separating the baby from her guardian." Karen frowned. "The regulations are clear." "The regulations also allow for caseworker discretion in emergency situations," Martinez said. He'd been reading over her shoulder. "Says so right there in section 12.4. Grace watched a silent battle play out on Karen's face. Bureaucratic caution warred with human compassion. Finally, the caseworker sighed. "I'd need regular check-ins, weekly home visits, documentation that all of the child's needs are being met. And Mrs. Thornton would need to start the foster care licensing process immediately." "Done," Grace said, before Tobias could object. "And Mr. McCoy would need to demonstrate progress toward stable employment and housing within 30 days. Tobias nodded. "I can do that." "This is highly irregular," Karen warned. "My supervisor isn't going to like it, but given the child's young age and the apparent stability of the current situation, I'm willing to recommend a temporary extension with conditions." After they left, taking their official papers and stern warnings with them, the house felt different. The casual comfort of the past 3 days had been replaced by the weight of scrutiny and deadlines. Tobias sat heavily on the couch, Lily sleeping peacefully in his arms, unaware that her entire future had just been decided by strangers. 30 days, he said quietly. We'll figure it out, Grace said, sitting beside him. Why? The question came out raw. You don't owe us anything. You could have just walked away. Grace looked at Lily's sleeping face, so peaceful and trusting. My husband and I tried for years to have children. Every treatment, every option we could think of. Nothing worked until after he was gone. She touched her belly. I guess I can't stand the thought of a child being taken from someone who wants to love her. Tobias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Thomas was a lucky man. I was the lucky one, Grace said softly. Outside, storm clouds gathered for another afternoon thunderstorm, the kind that rolled through the mountains every summer day like clockwork. But inside the farmhouse, 3 people who'd found each other through tragedy and chance sat together in the uncertain space between crisis and resolution. 30 days to prove their makeshift family was worth preserving. 30 days to show that sometimes the best homes are the ones that choose you, not the ones you're assigned to. It would have to be enough to start. But as the evening settled into uneasy quiet, Tobias stood at the window, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. I know who filed that complaint, he said. Grace looked up from where she sat with Lily. Who? Silas Gentry. Owns Gentry Timber Company. Tobias's voice was flat, controlled. He's the one who gave Jonah the loans that buried us. The one who foreclosed on our land. And now, he's making sure I can't challenge it by trying to take Lily away. Grace felt cold fury settle in her chest. Then we'll fight him too. Tobias turned from the window, his expression hard. We have 30 days to prove this family is worth keeping together. And in those 30 days, Gentry's going to do everything he can to tear us apart. Then he'll learn what mountain people are made of, Grace said quietly. We don't break easy. The Double Creek Ranch sprawled across 200 acres of West Virginia hillside like a patchwork quilt stitched together by God's own hand. 300 goats dotted the landscape, their bleating carrying on the afternoon breeze as Tobias pulled Grace's Ford Model T up the long dirt drive. Wade Morrison stood by the main barn, a man of 60 years who'd earned every line on his weathered face through honest work and honest dealing. His silver beard caught the sunlight as he looked up from the fence post he was mending, studying Tobias with the kind of eyes that had seen enough men to know the difference between those who talked and those who did. Heard about the auction, Wade said without preamble. Took guts to stand there with a baby. Tobias climbed out of the car, his boots finding purchase on the dusty ground. Didn't have much choice. She's all I got. Grace Thornton vouched for you. Said you need work. Wade set down his hammer and wiped his hands on pants that had seen 1,000 days just like this one. Woman's got good judgment. Her husband Thomas was a fine man. Taught my youngest to read when the boy was struggling in school. The mention of Thomas Thornton settled in Tobias's chest like a stone. He was standing here asking for help because a dead man's widow had shown him kindness. The weight of that debt felt heavier than any timber he'd ever carried. Yes, sir, Tobias said. I can do anything. Lumber work, hunting, livestock. Grew up in these mountains, doing all of it. Wade gestured toward the far pasture. See that goat over there? The brown one with the limp? Tobias followed his gaze, his eyes picking out the animal among the herd, with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading the land and everything on it. "Yes, sir." "What's wrong with her?" Tobias watched the goat's gait for 10 seconds, noting the way she favored her left front leg, the angle of her hoof when it touched the ground, the slight swelling just above the joint. "Hoof rot, left front, needs trimming and sulfur powder, maybe a week in a dry pen to let it heal proper." Wade's eyebrows rose a fraction. It was the closest thing to surprise Tobias had seen on the old rancher's face. "When can you start?" "Right now, if you need me." Wade nodded slowly, the gesture of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be second-guessing it. $18 a week, plus room and board. There's a cabin on the East Ridge. Needs some fixing, but it's got running water and a roof that doesn't leak more than it should. Tobias felt something loosen in his chest. A job. A place to live. 2 of the 3 things Karen Bishop had demanded he provide in 30 days. "I'll take it," he said. "But I need to bring the baby. And Mrs. Thornton's been helping me care for her during the day." Wade's expression didn't change. "Bring whoever you need. Just get the work done." They shook hands, 2 mountain men sealing a bargain the old way, with nothing but a firm grip and a man's word to back it. When Tobias returned to the farmhouse that evening, the sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him why people wrote poems about these mountains. Grace was on the front porch with Lily, rocking slowly in the old chair that had probably held 3 generations of her family. "Morrison gave me the job," Tobias said, climbing the steps with legs that ached from a full day's work. "And a cabin." Grace's face lit up with a smile that transformed her from merely pretty to something that made Tobias's chest tighten in ways he had no right to feel. "That's wonderful. When do you start?" "Started today. Spent the afternoon mending fences and treating a goat with hoof rot." He sat on the porch rail, suddenly aware of how bone-tired he was. "Cabin's about 5 miles from here. Wade says it needs work, but it'll do." "So you'll be moving out?" Grace's voice was carefully neutral, but something flickered across her face too quick to read. "Have to. Can't impose on your kindness forever." Tobias looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully in Grace's arms. "But the baby will need care during work hours." "I can't afford proper daycare on ranch wages, and bringing her to work every day wouldn't be fair to Wade or safe for her." Grace stood, cradling Lily with the natural ease she'd developed over the past week. "I could watch her. The library only needs me 3 days a week. The other days, I'm home anyway." "That's asking a lot." "I need the practice," Grace said, her hand moving to her own growing belly. "This one will be here in 5 months. Might as well learn with Lily first." They stood in the fading light, the evening sounds of the mountains rising around them. Crickets and distant cattle, the whisper of wind through old-growth timber, the kind of peace that could make a man forget how complicated his life had become. "Why are you doing this?" Tobias asked, not for the first time. Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the ridgeline. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief, mixed with something that might have been hope. "Thomas and I tried for 10 years to have a baby. Every doctor, every treatment, every prayer we could think of. Nothing worked." She looked down at Lily. "When he got sick, when we knew he was dying, he made me promise something. He said, 'Don't you dare become one of those widows who turns into a shrine keeper. Find someone who makes you laugh again. Find someone who will love our baby like their own.'" She met Tobias's eyes directly. "I saw you with Lily at that auction, and I saw a man who'd already lost everything, fighting to keep the one thing that mattered. I saw Thomas in that. The way he fought the tuberculosis, not because he thought he could win, but because giving up would mean abandoning me and the dream of our family. The guilt surged up in Tobias's throat, threatening to choke him. This woman was comparing him to her saint of a husband, and she didn't even know the truth. This woman was comparing him to her saint of a husband, and she didn't even know the truth.
Didn't know that Lily was his daughter, born of betrayal and weakness. That Jonah hadn't died in some random accident, but had driven drunk and suicidal after learning his wife had given another man the child he'd always wanted. "I'm not the man you think I am," Tobias said quietly. "Maybe not," Grace agreed, "but you're the father that baby needs. And right now, that's enough." The next evening, Grace found herself in the farmhouse kitchen, going through a box of Tobias's belongings to find clothes for Lily. The baby was growing fast, already outgrowing the few items they'd salvaged from the auction. Grace was looking for something specific, a warmer blanket for the cooling nights, when her fingers brushed against cloth that felt different from the rest. She pulled out a quilt, half-finished, its pattern a traditional Cherokee design in yellows and greens. The stitching was exquisite, each piece sewn with a care that spoke of love and anticipation. Tucked into the folds was a small leather-bound journal. Grace knew she shouldn't read it, knew it was a violation of privacy. She opened it anyway. The handwriting was feminine, rounded and careful. Naomi's journal. March 1st, 1924. Jonah came home drunk again. He didn't hit me, but the words hurt just as much. "I'm scared for the baby." March 15th. Toby came by to help fix the roof. Jonah was supposed to do it weeks ago, but he's never home anymore. Toby's hands were so gentle with the tools. I wonder if he'll be gentle with people, too. April 3rd. I've committed a sin. God forgive me. But Toby makes me feel safe in a way I haven't felt since I married Jonah. Just this once, I told myself. Just to remember what it feels like to be held without fear. Grace's hands trembled as she turned the pages. April 25th. It happened again. I know I should stop. I know this is wrong. But when Toby touches me, I don't feel like a punching bag waiting for the next insult. I feel human. May 20th. The baby moved today. Strong kicks. The doctor says it's a girl. Toby cried when I told him. I haven't told him the truth yet, that this baby isn't Jonah's, that she's his. God help me. I don't know how to tell either of them. The journal slipped from Grace's fingers, landing on the kitchen floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. Lily wasn't Tobias's niece. She was his daughter, born of an affair with his brother's wife. Grace sat heavily at the kitchen table, her mind racing through every interaction she'd had with Tobias over the past week. The way he held Lily, the way he knew her cries, her needs, her rhythms. She'd thought it was the devotion of an uncle stepping up. But it was the love of a father who couldn't claim his own child. The front door opened. Tobias's voice called out from the living room. "Grace? I finished fixing the porch rail like you asked." She looked down at the journal, then at the quilt, at the evidence of a life more complicated than the simple story Tobias had told. "Grace?" He appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at her face, then saw the journal on the floor. All the color drained from his face. "You read it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I shouldn't have," Grace said, but her voice was steady. "But I did." Tobias stood frozen in the doorway, a man waiting for judgment to fall. Before Grace could speak, before either of them could begin to navigate this new truth,
The sound of an automobile engine cut through the evening quiet. Car doors slammed, heavy boots on the porch steps. The pounding on the door was loud enough to wake Lily, who began to cry. Sheriff Burke's voice called through the wood. "Tobias McCoy, open up. We need to talk about that baby." Grace and Tobias locked eyes across the kitchen, the journal lying between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. "Did you know she was yours?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The pounding came again, harder this time. "Yes," Tobias said, "from the day she was born." "Open this door, McCoy, or I'm coming in." Grace stood, smoothing her dress with hands that shook only slightly. She picked up the journal, held it for a moment, then set it deliberately on the table between them. "We'll talk about this later," she said. "Right now, we have bigger problems." She walked past Tobias to answer the door, leaving him standing in the kitchen with the weight of his secrets finally exposed to the one person whose opinion had come to matter more than he'd ever intended. Outside, Sheriff Burke waited with 2 deputies and a woman in a severe gray suit, who introduced herself as Miss Porter from the State Child Welfare Office. They had papers, they had authority, and they had come to take Lily away. The battle for their makeshift family was about to begin in earnest. But first, Grace and Tobias would have to decide if they were still fighting on the same side. Grace opened the door to find Sheriff Clayton Burke looking decidedly uncomfortable, his hand resting on his belt in a way that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Behind him stood Miss Porter, the child welfare officer, her clipboard clutched like a shield, and 2 deputies who had the good grace to look at their boots rather than meet anyone's eyes. "Evening, Mrs. Thornton," Burke said, removing his hat. "We need to speak with Tobias McCoy. Official business regarding the child." Grace didn't move from the doorway. "What kind of official business requires 3 armed men and a social worker at 8 o'clock at night?" Miss Porter stepped forward, her voice crisp with bureaucratic authority. "We've received a formal complaint regarding Mr. McCoy's fitness as a guardian. We're here to conduct an immediate inspection of the living conditions and verify the child's welfare." "From who?" Tobias's voice came from behind Grace. He'd moved into the hallway, Lily cradled against his chest, his other hand instinctively protective around the baby's small body. "Who filed a complaint?" Burke shifted his weight. "That information is confidential, but the complaint alleges that you're housing the child in conditions unfit for an infant, that you have no stable employment, and that you've been less than forthcoming about your relationship to the baby." Grace felt Tobias stiffen behind her. The journal was still on the kitchen table, Naomi's handwriting a testament to truths that could destroy everything they'd been building. "May we come in?" Miss Porter asked, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a question. Grace stepped aside, watching as the officials filed into her home like pallbearers at a funeral. The living room that had felt like a sanctuary suddenly felt like a courtroom. Miss Porter's eyes swept the space with clinical efficiency. The makeshift changing station on the coffee table, the bottles drying in the dish rack visible through the kitchen doorway, the crib near the window where Lily spent her nights. She pulled out a form and began making notes with sharp, decisive strokes of her pen. "The conditions appear adequate," she said, sounding almost disappointed. "The child is clean, appropriately dressed, and the home is sanitary. However, Mr. McCoy, we have questions about the nature of your guardianship." Sheriff Burke cleared his throat. "Toby, the complaint says you're not actually the baby's uncle, that you've been misrepresenting your relationship to avoid scrutiny." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke after a fatal shot. Tobias's jaw worked, the muscles in his neck tight with tension. Grace could see him calculating, trying to figure out who could have known, who could have filed such a complaint. She already had her suspicions. "Who told you that?"
Tobias asked, his voice dangerously quiet.
"Does it matter?" Miss Porter interjected. "Mr. McCoy, are you or are you not a blood relative of this child?" The moment stretched out, brittle as old glass. Grace watched Tobias's face, saw the war playing out behind his eyes. Tell the truth and risk losing Lily immediately. Keep lying and risk worse consequences down the road. Before he could answer, Grace spoke. "He's her father." Every head turned toward her. "The biological father," Grace continued, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands. "Lily is Tobias McCoy's daughter, not his niece. He's been caring for his own child since the day she was born." Miss Porter's pen stilled on her clipboard. Sheriff Burke's eyes widened. The deputies exchanged glances that spoke volumes about small-town gossip they'd be spreading before breakfast. Tobias stared at Grace with an expression caught between gratitude and betrayal, as if he couldn't quite believe she'd just spoken the truth he'd been hiding. "Is this accurate, Mr. McCoy?" Miss Porter demanded. Tobias looked down at Lily, then back up, his eyes meeting Grace's across the crowded room. Something passed between them, an understanding born of crisis and trust that neither had expected to find. "Yes," he said quietly, "Lily is my daughter. Her mother was Naomi Clearwater McCoy, who was married to my brother Jonah at the time of her conception. Both parents died in a car accident 6 weeks ago. I am the only living parent, and I have been her primary caregiver since birth." The admission settled over the room like a shroud. Miss Porter's pen began moving again, faster now, her professional mask firmly in place. "Mr. McCoy, were you aware that providing false information to child welfare services is a criminal offense? That claiming to be a legal guardian under false pretenses can result in charges of fraud?" "I never claimed to be her guardian," Tobias said. "The hospital released her to me as her father. The paperwork all lists me as parent, not uncle. I used the word niece with people who wouldn't understand the full situation. That was wrong. But I never lied to the state." "The moral implications alone," Miss Porter began, but Sheriff Burke cut her off. "That's enough, Eleanor." The sheriff's use of her first name drew her attention. "This isn't about morality. It's about whether the baby is safe and cared for. And anyone with eyes can see she is." Miss Porter's face flushed. "Sheriff, the nature of the child's conception speaks to the father's character and judgment. A man who would have relations with his brother's wife is not necessarily fit to raise a child." "A man who stands by his child when the world's against him shows more character than most," Burke shot back. He turned to Tobias. "Who filed this complaint, son? Was it Gentry?" The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. "Silas Gentry?" Grace asked. "From the timber company?" Burke nodded grimly. "He's the one who pushed for the foreclosure on the McCoy land. Been trying to buy up timber rights in these mountains for years. Your brother Jonah owed him money, Toby. Money for loans that carried interest rates that would make a loan shark blush." Tobias's face darkened. "Jonah borrowed $300 to pay medical bills when Naomi was pregnant. Gentry charged him 400% interest. 6 months later, Jonah owed $1,200. That's how Gentry got the land. And Gentry knows that if you get back on your feet, you might challenge the foreclosure," Burke continued. "Easier to make sure you lose everything, including the baby. File a complaint with child welfare, get the kid taken away, and you've got no reason to stay in West Virginia. You leave, and he keeps the land without any fuss." Grace felt cold fury settle in her chest. So this is about timber rights? About money? He's trying to take a baby away from her father for 80 acres of trees? Gentry Timber has made a fortune buying distressed properties, Burke said. This is just business to him. The fact that he's destroying a family along the way doesn't enter into his calculations. Miss Porter looked between them, her pen hovering uncertainly over her clipboard. For the first time since entering the house, she looked less like a bureaucrat and more like a woman facing a moral dilemma. "I still have concerns," she said slowly. "Not about the child's current care, but about the long-term stability of this arrangement. Mrs. Thornton, you're providing housing out of charity. What happens if you decide tomorrow that this situation is too complicated? Mr. McCoy would be homeless with an infant. That's precisely the kind of instability we're trying to prevent." Grace looked at Tobias, really looked at him. This mountain man with his rough hands and guilty secrets, who sang wordless lullabies to a baby born of his greatest mistake, who worked dawn to dusk to provide for a child the world wanted to take away, who'd stood at that auction, knowing he might lose everything, but refusing to give up without a fight. She thought about Thomas, about his final words to her. "Find someone who makes you laugh again. Find someone who will love our baby like their own." She thought about the journal upstairs, Naomi's words describing a woman trapped in fear who'd found moments of safety in the wrong man's arms. About the complexity of human failing and the possibility of redemption. And she thought about the baby sleeping peacefully in Tobias's arms, innocent of all the adult complications that threatened her future. "I'm not providing housing out of charity," Grace said clearly. "I'm providing it as family." Every eye in the room turned to her. "Tobias and I are getting married," Grace continued, the words coming with a certainty she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. "We'll file the paperwork tomorrow. Pastor Vernon has already agreed to perform the ceremony. Lily will have 2 legal parents, a stable home, and the kind of family structure that even child welfare can't object to." The silence that followed could have been measured in geological time. Tobias stared at her, as if she'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. "Grace, you don't have to do this." "I know I don't have to," Grace said, meeting his eyes. "I'm choosing to. For Lily. For the baby I'm carrying who deserves to grow up with a sister. And for us, because I think we could build something good here if we're brave enough to try." Miss Porter found her voice first. "Mrs. Thornton, marriage based on desperation rather than genuine commitment rarely provides the stability children need." "You're right," Grace agreed. "But this isn't desperation. It's choice. I choose to stand with a man who's trying to do right by his daughter. I choose to build a family from unconventional pieces. And I choose to believe that love can grow from respect and shared purpose just as much as from romantic passion." She turned to Tobias, her voice softening. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to be my partner in raising these children. To share the load and the joy. To build something neither of us thought we'd have again." Tobias shifted Lily to one arm, then reached out and took Grace's hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. "More honored than I deserve." Sheriff Burke cleared his throat. "Well, Miss Porter? Sounds like stability to me." The social worker looked at her clipboard, then at the baby sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, then at Grace and Tobias, standing hand in hand in the middle of a living room full of witnesses. "I'll need to see the marriage certificate once it's filed," she said finally. "And I'll be conducting monthly home visits for the next 6 months. But barring any changes in circumstance, I see no reason to remove the child from her father's care, especially once he has a legal spouse providing additional support. She snapped her clipboard shut with a decisive click. This investigation is closed, for now. After they left, after the car doors slammed and the engine faded into the distance, Grace and Tobias stood in the sudden quiet of the farmhouse. Lily had fallen back asleep, her small fingers curled around Tobias's collar, her breath warm and even against his chest. "You didn't have to do that," Tobias said again. "I know. You don't even know the whole truth about what happened between me and Naomi, about Jonah." Grace walked to the kitchen and returned with Naomi's journal. She held it out to him. "I read enough to understand. Jonah was a drunk who hurt his wife with words, if not fists. Naomi was scared and lonely. You were kind to her when no one else was. Human beings make mistakes when they're hurting. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable." Tobias took the journal with his free hand, staring down at the worn leather cover. Jonah found out the truth 2 days before the accident. Naomi told him the baby wasn't his. He went on a bender, got behind the wheel, drunk as a skunk, and drove that car off Morgan's Ridge, doing 60 miles an hour, with his pregnant wife in the passenger seat. His voice cracked. "I killed him, Grace. As sure as if I'd put a gun to his head." "No," Grace said firmly. "Jonah killed himself, and he tried to take Naomi and Lily with him. That's on him, not you. You didn't pour the whiskey down his throat. You didn't put him behind that wheel. He made his choices, and they were the wrong ones. I betrayed my brother." "Yes, and you'll carry that for the rest of your life." But Lily didn't betray anyone. She deserves a father who stays, who fights for her, who builds a life worth living despite the guilt. Grace stepped closer. "Can you do that, Toby? Can you be that father?" Tobias looked down at Lily, then back at Grace. Tears tracked through the dust on his weathered face. "I can try." "Then that's enough." Grace reached up and wiped the tears from his cheek with her thumb, the gesture startlingly intimate despite the layers of complication between them. "We should talk about the practical details," she said, stepping back to give him space. "The wedding, living arrangements, how we explain this to people." "People are going to talk," Tobias warned. "A pregnant widow marrying a man who fathered a child with his brother's wife? The gossip will be brutal." "Let them talk," Grace said. "I spent too many years worrying about what people thought. Thomas taught me that, at the end, all that matters is whether you can look yourself in the mirror and know you did right by the people who needed you." She moved to the window, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. "Besides, we're not doing this for their approval. We're doing it for Lily, for the baby I'm carrying, for the chance to build something good out of broken pieces." Tobias joined her at the window, Lily still sleeping against his shoulder. They stood in silence for a moment, two people on the edge of a leap neither had planned to take. "I don't deserve this," Tobias said quietly. "Don't deserve you giving up your life for my mistakes." "I'm not giving up my life," Grace corrected. "I'm starting a new one. There's a difference." She turned to face him directly. "I loved Thomas with everything I had. He was a good man who deserved better than the illness that took him so young. But he's gone, and I'm still here, with a child coming who needs a father, and a life that feels empty in a house too big for one person." Grace placed her hand over her heart. "You're not my great love story, Toby McCoy. But maybe you could be my second chapter, the one where I learned that family isn't just about romance and passion. Sometimes it's about showing up every day and doing the hard work of caring for each other. I can do that, Tobias said. The showing up part. The work. Then we have a foundation, Grace said. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. Outside, the first stars were appearing, pinpricks of light against the vast indifference of the universe. Inside the farmhouse, a mountain man, a widow, and two babies who didn't yet know their own names were becoming something that looked like a family. It wasn't the family any of them had planned for. But in the summer of 1924, in the hills of West Virginia, where coal and timber built fortunes on the backs of men who'd never see those riches, it was the family they had, and sometimes that was enough. The next morning, Grace woke to find Tobias already up, sitting at the kitchen table with Lily in one arm and Naomi's journal in his other hand. He looked up when Grace entered, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep or tears, or both. "I've been reading her words," he said quietly. "Naomi wrote about being scared, about Jonah's drinking getting worse, about feeling trapped in a marriage that was killing her spirit, even if it never touched her body." He closed the journal gently, as if it were a fragile thing that might crumble at rough handling. "She wrote that I made her feel safe, that for 3 brief times she forgot to be afraid." His voice broke. "That's what I gave her. Not love, not rescue. Just 3 moments where fear didn't have its claws in her throat." Grace sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "And what did she give you?" Tobias looked at Lily, his daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms. "She gave me this. A reason to be better than I was. A chance to do right by someone who needs me." He met Grace's eyes. "And then she died because I couldn't protect her from my brother's rage." "You're not God, Toby. You couldn't have known Jonah would do what he did." "I should have seen it coming. Should have known a drunk with a wounded pride is a dangerous thing." Grace reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "We can spend the rest of our lives listing the things we should have done differently. Or we can spend it building something better for these babies. Which sounds more like living to you?" Tobias turned his hand over, his rough palm against Grace's smooth one. "I'll marry you, Grace Thornton. I'll stand up in front of God and Pastor Vernon and anyone else who wants to watch. And I'll promise to be a good husband and father. But I need you to know one more thing." "What's that?" "I'm falling in love with you," Tobias said. The words simple and devastating in their honesty. "Not because you're saving me, though you are. Not because it's convenient, though it is. But because you're the strongest, kindest, bravest woman I've ever met. And spending the rest of my life trying to deserve you sounds like the best possible way to redeem the worst mistake I ever made." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and warm. She'd thought this would be a marriage of convenience, of practical partnership and shared responsibility. She hadn't prepared herself for the possibility that it might become something more. "Then I suppose," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "we'd better make this official before I come to my senses and realize how absolutely insane this whole plan is." Tobias laughed, the sound rusty but genuine, and for the first time since Grace had met him at that auction, she saw what he might have looked like before grief and guilt had carved lines into his face. She saw the man he could become, given time and grace, and the kind of love that grows slow and steady, like oak trees in mountain soil. Outside, the sun was rising over the Appalachian ridges, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. Inside the farmhouse, 2 broken people and 2 innocent babies were becoming a family. It would take more than one conversation, more than one decision, more than one leap of faith, but they had made a start.
And sometimes, a start is all you need. 3 days after Grace's impulsive proposal, Marshal Henry Dalton rode into Harlow Springs on a bay mare that had seen better days, but still carried herself with the dignity of a war horse. The federal marshal's badge on his vest caught the morning sunlight as he dismounted in front of a sheriff's office, his boots hitting the dusty street with a kind of authority that made people pay attention. Sheriff Clayton Burke looked up from his desk to find Dalton filling his doorway, a manila folder thick with documents tucked under one arm. "Sheriff Burke," Dalton said without preamble, "I'm investigating loan sharking and land fraud running from Charleston to the Kentucky border. Name Silas Gentry keeps appearing in my files. 14 times, to be exact." Burke's face went pale. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly before he set it down with exaggerated care. "Federal Marshal," Burke said, trying for casual and landing somewhere near terrified. "What brings you all the way out here?" Dalton dropped the folder on Burke's desk. It landed with a thud that felt final as a coffin lid closing. "Gentry Timber has been buying up distressed properties across 3 counties. Always the same pattern. Loans with interest rates that would make a mobster blush. Foreclosures pushed through faster than legal. And in every case, the paperwork shows signatures from local law enforcement and judges who've since retired or moved on." Burke swallowed hard. "I just enforced legal court orders. That's my job." "Whose court orders?" Dalton leaned against the desk, his eyes never leaving Burke's face. "Judge Harlow retired 2 years ago. Who's been signing foreclosure decrees since then?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. "I need to check the records," Burke stammered. "No need. I already checked." Dalton opened the folder and pulled out a document, laying it on the desk with the careful precision of a man dealing cards he knew would win the hand. "This is the foreclosure decree for the McCoy property, signed by Judge Harlow, dated 3 months ago." Burke stared at the paper, his face now the color of old milk. "Problem is," Dalton continued, "Judge Harlow was in Florida 3 months ago, recovering from pneumonia. Has sworn statements from 6 witnesses and a doctor's note to prove it. Which means someone forged his signature on this document. And given that you're the one who enforced it, Sheriff, you either knew about the forgery or you're criminally negligent." Burke's hand went to his collar, loosening it as if the room had suddenly lost all its air. "Silas brought the papers to me. I didn't question them. He said everything was legal." "How much did he pay you?" The question was delivered with the casual tone of asking about the weather, but Burke flinched as if he'd been struck. $50 a month, Burke whispered, "to supplement my salary. I didn't know the papers were fake. I swear I didn't know." Dalton nodded slowly, the gesture of a man who'd heard this song before and knew all the verses. "That's good, Sheriff. Cooperation will help when this goes to trial. Now, I need you to tell me everything about Silas Gentry's business dealings in this county. Every property, every loan, every person he's pushed out." While Marshal Dalton was extracting Burke's confession, Grace Thornton was dealing with a visitor of her own. The knock on the farmhouse door came mid-morning, tentative and uncertain. Grace opened it to find Ruth McCoy standing on the porch, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the 6 weeks since Grace had last seen her. The older woman's hair was clean, but gray as winter clouds, and her clothes hung loose on a frame that had carried too much sorrow and not enough food. In her hands, Ruth carried a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Mrs. Thornton," Ruth said, her voice rough from decades of cigarettes and harder living, "I came to apologize, and to see my granddaughter, if you'll allow it." Grace's first instinct was to close the door. This was the woman who'd raised Jonah, who'd looked the other way while her son drank himself into rages, who'd failed both her boys in ways that had cascading consequences. But Grace had learned over the past weeks that people were more complicated than their worst moments, and redemption required someone willing to open the door. "Come in," Grace said. Ruth stepped inside with the careful movements of someone entering a sacred space they weren't sure they belonged in. Her eyes immediately found Lily, who was lying on a blanket on the floor, reaching for the sunbeams streaming through the window. "She's beautiful," Ruth whispered, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. "Looks just like Naomi. Same dark hair, same delicate features. Would you like to hold her?" Grace asked, surprising herself with the offer. Ruth's hands trembled as she set down the basket and lowered herself to the floor beside Lily. She didn't immediately pick up the baby, just ran one finger along Lily's cheek with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the rough woman Grace had expected. "I was a terrible mother," Ruth said, not looking up. "Started drinking after my husband died in the mines back in '98. Jonah was 6. Toby was 10. They raised themselves more than I raised them." She finally lifted Lily, cradling the baby against her chest, with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this before, in better times. "Jonah was always angry. Even as a boy, I tried to love it out of him, but I was too broken myself. When he started drinking, I recognized it. The same demon that had me. I should have stopped him, should have gotten him help, but I was drowning in my own bottle." Grace sat in the chair opposite, her hand unconsciously moving to her own growing belly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know what people are saying, about you marrying Toby, about the baby not being Jonah's." Ruth looked up, her eyes clear despite the tears. "I know the truth, Mrs. Thornton. Naomi told me before she died. Told me Lily was Toby's daughter. Asked me to forgive them both." Grace felt her breath catch. "And did you?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Lily, who had grasped her finger with surprising strength. "Naomi came to my trailer the week before she died. She was 8 months pregnant, scared out of her mind. Said Jonah had been drinking for 3 days straight, saying terrible things. She asked if she could stay with me, just for a few nights, until he calmed down." Ruth's voice broke. "I told her no. Said she'd made her bed when she married him, now she had to lie in it. I was drunk when I said it, so drunk I could barely stand. But I said it anyway." The old woman's tears fell freely now, landing on Lily's blanket like rain on parched earth. 2 days later, Jonah came to my place. Told me the baby wasn't his, that Naomi had been with Toby. He was crying and screaming and so drunk he could barely walk. I told him to go home, sleep it off. Instead, he got in his truck with Naomi and drove it off Morgan's Ridge. Ruth looked at Grace with eyes that had seen the bottom of too many bottles and the depths of too much regret. "I could have saved them, could have stopped him, called the sheriff, done something. But I was too far gone in my own poison to see straight. So I'm as guilty as anyone for what happened to Naomi and Jonah." Grace felt tears pricking her own eyes. "What are you asking for, Ruth?" "Forgiveness," Ruth said simply. "And a chance to be part of Lily's life. Not as a guardian. I know I'm not fit for that. But as her grandmother. Someone who can tell her about her family, about the good parts before everything went wrong." She reached into her basket with one hand while still holding Lily with the other. "I brought this. It's the quilt Naomi started for the baby. I finished it. Been sober 6 weeks now, longest stretch in 10 years. Had to keep my hands busy, so I sewed." The quilt was beautiful, Cherokee patterns in yellows and greens, every stitch precise, despite being done by hands that probably shook from withdrawal. It was an offering, a peace treaty sewn in thread and hope. Grace took the quilt, feeling the weight of it, the hours of work and intention. "You can see Lily," Grace said, "on Sundays. Come for dinner. But Ruth, if you show up drunk, if you fall back into old patterns, this door closes. These children deserve better." "They do," Ruth agreed, "and I'm going to try to be better. For them, for my boys, for all the years I wasted." That afternoon, while Grace was making peace with Ruth McCoy, Tobias was at the Double Creek Ranch when Wade Morrison called him into the barn office. "Got something to tell you," Wade said, closing the door behind them. "And you're not going to like it." Tobias felt his stomach tighten. He'd learned that nothing good ever started with those words. Wade pulled out a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. "Found this while cleaning out old files. From 1918, right after the war ended." The headline read, "Local Hero Returns." The photograph showed a younger Tobias in his army uniform, standing ramrod straight, medals pinned to his chest. Tobias stared at the image of a man he barely recognized. "What's your point, Wade?" "Point is, you're not just some mountain man with a checkered past. You served in France, got a Silver Star for pulling 3 men out of a burning transport under enemy fire. The Army tried to give you a promotion, but you turned it down and came home early because your brother wrote saying he needed help with the family land." Wade tapped the newspaper. "That's the kind of man you are, Toby. A man who puts family first, even when family doesn't deserve it. A man who runs toward danger to save others." "Ancient history," Tobias muttered. "No, it's character," Wade corrected. "And when word gets out that Silas Gentry is trying to take a war hero's land through fraud, folks in this county are going to have opinions, strong ones." Tobias looked up sharply. "What do you mean, fraud?" Wade explained about the forged foreclosure papers, about Marshal Dalton's investigation, about Sheriff Burke's confession. With each revelation, Tobias felt something shift in his chest. The land his family had held for 3 generations might not be lost after all. "Federal Marshal wants to talk to you," Wade said. "Says you might have grounds to challenge the foreclosure, get your land back." Tobias thought about the 80 acres, the cabin where he'd been born, the creek where his father had taught him to fish, the graves of his grandparents on the hill overlooking the valley. He'd thought all of it was gone, sold to pay debts that now might not have been legal in the first place. "When does he want to see me?" "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, at the sheriff's office." Wade clapped him on the shoulder. "Go get your land back, son. And when you do, bring that family of yours home where they belong." That evening, Tobias returned to the farmhouse to find Grace in the kitchen with Ruth McCoy, the 2 women working together to prepare dinner, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Lily was in Ruth's arms, and the old woman was singing something soft in a language Tobias didn't recognize. "Cherokee lullaby," Ruth explained when she saw him watching. "Naomi taught it to me. Thought Lily should know her mama's songs." Tobias felt a lump rise in his throat. His mother, sober and gentle with Lily, singing the songs of the woman whose life had been destroyed in part by the McCoy family's failures. It was the kind of circular grace that didn't make logical sense, but felt right in a way that transcended logic. "There's stew on the stove," Grace said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And Wade called. Said you needed to talk to me about something important?" Tobias nodded, suddenly aware of how many important conversations he'd had in this kitchen over the past weeks. It was becoming the heart of their makeshift family, the place where hard truths were spoken and decisions made. "Marshal Dalton says the foreclosure on our family land was based on forged documents. Says I might be able to get it back."
Grace's eyes widened. "That's wonderful." "Maybe," Tobias said carefully. "But if I get the land back, I'll need to live on it, work it, build it back up to what it was. Can't do that from here." Understanding dawned on Grace's face. "You'd want us to move there, to the McCoy homestead." "Only if you're willing," Tobias said quickly. "This is your family's land, your grandmother's house. I wouldn't ask you to leave it unless you wanted to." Grace looked around the farmhouse, at the photographs on the mantel, and the familiar worn furniture, and the memories soaked into every board and nail. This had been her sanctuary after Thomas died, the place where she'd learned to be alone without being lonely. But it had also been empty until Tobias and Lily filled it with noise and need and the messy business of living. "How much land?" she asked. 80 acres. Most of it timber, but there's 20 acres of good pasture. Creek runs through the property. The cabin needs work, probably a full rebuild, but the land itself is solid. Grace walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had stood witness to generations of McCoys building and breaking and building again. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we move to the homestead, we do it as partners. Not you returning to your family land with me tagging along as the hired help. Full partners in whatever we build there." "Full partners," Tobias agreed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Ruth spoke up from her place by the stove, Lily still cradled in her arms. "The homestead is a good place to raise children. Got a spring house for keeping things cool, old-growth timber for shade, and enough room for babies to run when they get bigger. My husband always said it was blessed land." "Then we'll make it blessed again," Grace said, turning back to Tobias. "We'll take that land that's seen so much sorrow and fill it with something better. Not perfection, but honest effort. Not forgetting the past, but not letting it dictate the future either." Tobias crossed the kitchen and took her hands, marveling at how small they felt in his rough palms, how soft despite the hard work she'd been doing. "I don't deserve this," he said. "Don't deserve you giving up your home for mine." "Then spend the rest of your life earning it," Grace replied. "That's how marriage works, I'm told. We take turns being strong for each other, take turns being the one who needs saving, and we show up every day to do the work." She pulled one hand free and placed it on his chest, over his heart. "You saved Lily. I saved both of you. Now we save each other. That's partnership." From across the room, Ruth McCoy watched the young couple with tears streaming down her weathered face. "Naomi would have loved this," she whispered. "Would have loved knowing her baby girl was going to grow up with this kind of love around her." Tobias looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw what sobriety was revealing. The woman she'd been before grief and alcohol had stolen her away. The grandmother Lily deserved to know. "You'll come too," he said impulsively. "When we move to the homestead. There's the old cottage by the creek where Grandma McCoy used to live. It's small, but it's sound. You could have it if you stay sober." Ruth's tears fell harder. "You'd trust me with that? After everything?" "You're showing up," Tobias said simply. "Doing the work. That's all anyone can do. And Lily should know her grandmother. The real one, not the one the bottle created." They stood in the warm kitchen as evening settled over the mountains. 3 adults and 2 babies, bound together by tragedy and choice, and the stubborn hope that people could change if they wanted it badly enough. Outside, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring Marshall Dalton and legal proceedings and the complicated business of reclaiming what had been stolen. There would be gossip and judgment, and people who'd never understand why a pregnant widow
would marry a man who'd fathered a child with his brother's wife. But tonight, in this kitchen, they had something more powerful than other people's opinions. They had each other. And in the summer of 1924, in the mountains of West Virginia, where life was hard and love was harder, that was more than most people could claim. The next morning would bring revelations that would shake Harlow Springs to its foundations. Silas Gentry's empire of fraud would begin to crumble. The community would be forced to choose sides between money and justice, and Grace and Tobias would face their greatest test yet. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, they had this moment of peace. The word spread through Harlow Springs, the way fire spreads through dry timber, fast and consuming everything in its path. By noon on Thursday, every soul in town knew that Marshal Henry Dalton had arrested Silas Gentry for fraud, forgery, and racketeering. By evening, half the county had gathered in the street outside the courthouse, waiting to see what would happen next. Tobias stood at the edge of the crowd, Grace beside him with Lily in her arms. The evening air carried the weight of summer storm clouds building over the mountains, the kind that promised either cleansing rain or destructive violence, depending on which way the wind blew. "There," Grace said quietly, pointing toward the courthouse steps. Marshal Dalton emerged first, his hand firm on the arm of Silas Gentry. The timber baron wore his expensive three-piece suit, but handcuffs glinted at his wrists, and his usual smug expression had been replaced by something that looked like genuine fear. Behind them came Sheriff Burke, his badge noticeably absent from his chest, and a county prosecutor who'd driven up from Charleston specifically for this arrest. The crowd murmured, a sound like bees disturbed from their hive, angry and uncertain. Silas's eyes swept the gathering until they found Tobias. Even in custody, even facing federal charges, the man managed a sneer. "This isn't over, McCoy," Gentry called out, his voice carrying across the square. "I've got lawyers. I've got friends in Charleston. You think you can take me down with some forged papers? I'll be out by morning, and you'll still be a mountain trash with a bastard baby and debts you can't pay." The words hung in the summer air like a challenge. Tobias felt Grace's hand tighten on his arm, a warning not to take the bait. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Silas." Judge Thomas Harlow stepped out from the crowd, his white hair catching the fading sunlight. Though retired, the old judge still carried the authority of 3 decades on the bench, and when he spoke, people listened. "You forged my name on legal documents," Harlow said, his voice carrying the weight of betrayal. "Used my reputation to steal from families who'd lived on this land since before West Virginia was even a state. That's not just fraud, Silas. That's an assault on the very foundation of law and order in this community." Gentry's sneer faltered. "You can't prove anything." "I have 6 foreclosure decrees with your signature as witness, and mine as judge," Marshal Dalton interjected. "Problem is, Judge Harlow was in Florida for pneumonia when 4 of them were supposedly signed. And a handwriting expert in Charleston has already confirmed the signatures are forgeries. Quite good ones, I'll admit, but forgeries nonetheless." The crowd's murmur grew louder, shifting from uncertain to angry. Wade Morrison pushed through to stand beside Tobias. "How many families, Silas? How many properties did you steal?" "I didn't steal anything," Gentry shot back, desperation creeping into his voice. "They owed legitimate debts. 400% interest is high, but it's not illegal." "Actually," the prosecutor spoke up, "in West Virginia, any interest rate above 36%
is considered usury and is very much illegal. You've been operating a criminal enterprise for at least 5 years. Every loan you made is void. Every foreclosure is invalid. The implications of that statement rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Families who'd lost their land, businesses that had been forced to close, lives destroyed by debt that was never legal in the first place. An old farmer named Cooper stepped forward, his face weathered by 70 years of mountain living. "You took my dairy farm 3 years ago. Said I owed you $800 on a $200 loan.
I had to move my family to Charleston, work in a factory. My wife died there, couldn't breathe the city air with her weak lungs." A woman Tobias recognized from the general store spoke up next. "You foreclosed on my husband's smithy. He'd borrowed money to buy new equipment, and you charged him so much interest he could never catch up. He killed himself rather than see his family homeless." More voices joined in, a chorus of grievances long suppressed by fear and hopelessness. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were testifying, bearing witness to years of predation that had been hidden behind legal-looking paperwork and expensive suits. Marshal Dalton held up his hand for quiet. "I understand your anger, and I promise you, justice will be served. But right now, I need to transport this prisoner to Charleston for arraignment. The courts will sort out property claims and restitution." He turned to Tobias directly. "Mr. McCoy, the foreclosure on your family's 80 acres is officially voided. The property reverts to you as of this moment. You have my word." Tobias felt the words hit him like a physical force. The land. His father's land, his grandfather's land, stretching back 3 generations. Not lost after all, not stolen beyond recovery. Grace squeezed his arm, her eyes shining with tears. Lily chose that moment to reach up and grab a handful of Tobias's beard, pulling with the innocent strength of a baby who didn't understand that she'd just witnessed her father reclaim her heritage. "What about the others?" Tobias asked, his voice rough. "Cooper's farm, the smithy, all the other properties Gentry stole." Marshal Dalton nodded. "Every fraudulent foreclosure will be reviewed. It'll take time, maybe months, but we'll make it right." As Dalton led Gentry toward the waiting automobile, the timber baron tried one last time to salvage his dignity. "You people are fools," he spat. "I brought jobs to this county, money, progress. Without me, you'll go back to being nothing but hillbillies scratching in the dirt." Pastor Vernon stepped out from the crowd, his presence commanding silence. "We'd rather scratch in our own dirt than prosper on stolen land. The good book says ill-gotten gains profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. You forgot that, Silas, and now you'll pay the price." The crowd parted to let Dalton's car through, and with it went the man who'd terrorized Harlow Springs with paper and pen instead of guns and violence. Sometimes the worst criminals wore expensive suits and smiled while they destroyed lives. As the dust settled from the departing automobile, the crowd began to disperse, but with a different energy than when they'd gathered. There was anger still, but also hope. A sense that maybe, just maybe, the little people could win against the powerful if they stood together. Wade Morrison clapped Tobias on the shoulder. "Congratulations, son. You got your land back. What are you going to do with it?" Tobias looked at Grace, at Lily, at the mountains that had witnessed every McCoy joy and sorrow for 90 years. "Build something better than what was there before," he said. "A home, a family, a future." That evening, after the excitement had died down and Lily was asleep, Tobias and Grace sat on the farmhouse porch, watching lightning flicker in the distant clouds.
The storm that had threatened all day still hadn't broken, leaving the air thick and electric with possibility. "Ruth wants to help with the wedding," Grace said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She's been sober 7 weeks now. Longest stretch she's had in 20 years, according to Wade." "What kind of help?" Tobias asked, warily. "She wants to make my dress. Says she used to sew wedding gowns before the drinking got bad. Found her old sewing machine in storage and cleaned it up." Grace smiled. "I think she needs to feel useful.
Needs to contribute something good instead of just taking up space." Tobias considered this. His mother sewing Grace's wedding dress. The woman who'd failed both her sons, now trying to make amends by helping create something beautiful for the family they were building. "If you're comfortable with it, I think it's a fine idea," he said. They sat quietly for another moment before Grace spoke again, her voice careful. "Pastor Vernon came by the library today. Said he needs to speak with both of us before the wedding. About expectations and vows and what marriage means in the eyes of God." "What did you tell him?" "That we'd come by Saturday afternoon." Grace turned to look at Tobias directly. "He's going to ask if we love each other. What should we say?" Tobias thought about the question, about the complicated truth of what had grown between them over these past weeks. It wasn't the passionate romance of storybooks. It wasn't love at first sight, or destiny, or any of the pretty words people used to describe the joining of two lives. "We should say the truth," he said finally, "that we respect each other, that we're committed to making this work, that we're building something together that's bigger than either of us alone, and that love, the real kind that lasts, grows from those things." Grace nodded slowly. "Pastor Vernon is old-fashioned. He might not accept that." "Then he doesn't have to marry us. We'll find someone who will." Tobias reached over and took her hand. "I won't lie in a church, Grace. Not to God and not to you. If Vernon needs us to pretend feelings we don't have yet, we'll go somewhere else." "Yet," Grace repeated softly. "You said feelings we don't have yet. Like you think they might come?" Tobias looked at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused, hers soft, but growing stronger from the work of caring for Lily and preparing for her own child. "I think I could fall in love with you, Grace Thornton. I think maybe I'm already halfway there, and just too scared to admit it. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, the kindest, the one person who looked at all my failures and mistakes and decided I was worth saving anyway." He met her eyes. "Yeah, I think those feelings could come, are coming. Just need time to catch up to the decision we already made." Grace's eyes glistened in the gathering darkness. "Thomas told me once that the best marriages aren't built on lightning strikes and butterflies. They're built on showing up every day and choosing to love even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Sounds like a wise man. He was. Grace squeezed Tobias's hand. "And I think he'd approve of you, of us. He'd say we're doing it backwards, making the commitment before the feelings catch up. But he'd also say that sometimes backwards is the only way forward." Thunder rumbled closer now, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. They sat together as the storm finally broke, watching sheets of rain sweep across the valley, washing the dust from the air and the earth. It was the kind of rain that renewed things, that made crops grow and creeks run clear, that reminded everyone in these mountains that destruction and creation were sometimes the same force wearing different faces. Saturday afternoon found them in Pastor Vernon's small office behind the Baptist church. The room smelled of old books and furniture polish, with a single window looking out onto the cemetery, where generations of Harlow Springs families rested under simple stone markers. Pastor Vernon was 70 if he was a day, with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen everything human nature had to offer, and still managed to believe in redemption. He gestured for them to sit in the worn chairs across from his desk. "I've known you both for some years now," Vernon began, his voice gentle but firm. "Grace, you and Thomas were faithful members of this congregation. Tobias, your family has been here since my grandfather built this church in 1856. So I feel I can speak plainly." "Please do," Grace said. Vernon folded his hands on his desk. "This marriage you're planning, it's happening awfully fast. Grace, your husband has been gone barely a year. You're pregnant with his child. Tobias, you're dealing with the loss of your brother and caring for your infant daughter. Some might say you're both running from grief instead of running toward love." "Some might say that," Tobias agreed. "They'd be partly right." The pastor's eyebrows rose. "Go on." "We are running from grief," Tobias continued, "but we're also running toward something better. A chance to build a family for these children. A partnership based on respect and shared purpose. Maybe that's not the romantic ideal, Pastor, but it's honest." Vernon turned to Grace. "And you, my dear? What are you running toward?" Grace was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on her growing belly. "I'm running toward not being alone, toward giving my child a father and siblings, and a home that feels alive, instead of like a museum to my dead husband's memory. Thomas was a good man, Pastor Vernon, the best I knew, but he's gone, and I'm still here, and life doesn't stop just because we wish it would." "Do you love Tobias?" Vernon asked directly. "I'm learning to," Grace said. "I respect him. I admire him. I trust him with my life and with these children. The romantic love, the kind that makes your heart skip, maybe that comes later. Or maybe it doesn't. But I think a marriage built on respect and commitment has better odds than one built on passion that burns out after the honeymoon." Vernon leaned back in his chair, studying them both with eyes that missed nothing. "The Bible speaks of many kinds of love. Eros, the romantic passion. Philia, the friendship between equals. Agape, the sacrificial love that puts others first. You're describing agape, the kind of love that says, 'I will show up for you day after day, even when it's hard.'" "That's exactly what we're describing," Tobias said. "Then I'll marry you," Vernon said. "Not because you have all the answers, or because I think this is perfect, but because I've seen too many marriages built on passion alone crumble when reality sets in. You two are starting with reality and building toward something more. That's wisdom, even if it looks backwards." He pulled out a worn Bible and opened it to a marked page. "We'll use the traditional vows, but I'm adding one thing. A promise that you'll both continue courting each other after marriage. That you'll make time for conversation and shared moments and the building of intimacy that leads to real love. Can you commit to that?" "Yes," they said together. Vernon smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Then let's talk about the ceremony. When were you thinking?" 2 weeks from today," Grace said. "I'll be 5 months pregnant by then. Any later and I'll be too uncomfortable to stand for the service." 2 weeks it is. Vernon made a note in his calendar. "Small ceremony or large?" "Small," Tobias said. "Just family and close friends. We're not trying to make a spectacle." "Given the circumstances, that's probably wise." Vernon looked at them seriously. "You know people will talk. A pregnant widow marrying a man who fathered a child with his brother's wife. The gossip will be cruel." "Let them talk," Grace said firmly. "We know the truth. We know our intentions.
That's all that matters." The pastor nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. Marriage is between the two of you and God. Everyone else is just audience." As they were leaving, Vernon called Tobias back. "A word, son?" Grace took Lily and went to wait outside, leaving the two men alone.
"I knew your father," Vernon said. "John McCoy was a good man, honest, hard-working, faithful to your mother until the day the mine collapse took him. He'd be proud of you, Tobias. Proud that you're stepping up for your daughter. Proud that you're building a life instead of running from your mistakes." Tobias felt his throat tighten. "I'm not sure I deserve that, Pastor." "None of us deserve God's grace. We just accept it and try to live worthy of the gift." Vernon placed a hand on Tobias's shoulder. "Your father made mistakes too. Every man does. But he taught you what matters: family, honor, showing up when things are hard. You're doing that now. Don't let guilt rob you of the good you're building." When Tobias emerged from the church, he found Grace sitting on a bench under an old oak tree, Lily sleeping in her arms. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, painting them both in golden light that made them look like something from a painting. Grace looked up and smiled. "Everything all right?" "Everything's all right," Tobias said, and for the first time in weeks, he almost believed it. They had 2 weeks until the wedding, 2 weeks to prepare for a marriage that defied convention but somehow felt right anyway. 2 weeks before they stood before God and community and promised to build something lasting from broken pieces. It wasn't the storybook romance either of them had imagined, but it was real, and it was theirs. And in the mountains of West Virginia, where life came hard and love came harder, that was more than enough. The wedding took place on a Saturday morning in late August, when the mountain air held just the first whisper of autumn's promise. The Baptist church was half full, which was either a testament to community support or morbid curiosity, depending on who you asked. Tobias didn't much care which. He stood at the altar in the only suit he owned, the same one he'd worn to his brother's funeral, and waited for his future to walk down the aisle. Ruth McCoy sat in the front pew, 2 months sober and steady, and wearing a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Grace had helped her pick out. In her arms, Lily wore a tiny white gown that matched the wedding dress Ruth had spent 2 weeks creating, every stitch an act of redemption. The baby was awake and alert, her dark eyes taking in the stained glass windows and the flowers Wade Morrison's wife had arranged on every available surface. The organ began to play, and every head turned toward the back of the church. Grace appeared in the doorway, and Tobias felt his breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or practicality, and everything to do with the simple fact that she was beautiful. The dress Ruth had made was ivory silk, simple in design, but elegant, with long sleeves and a high neck that accommodated her growing belly with grace rather than trying to hide it. Her brown hair was swept up, revealing a face that had lost some of its grief shadows and found something that looked like peace. She walked down the aisle alone, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning from the meadow behind the farmhouse. No father to give her away, no bridesmaids in matching dresses. Just a woman choosing her own path and walking it with her head held high. When she reached the altar, Tobias offered his hand. She took it, and together they turned to face Pastor Vernon. "Dearly beloved," Vernon began, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join together Tobias James McCoy and Grace Ellen Thornton in holy matrimony." The traditional words washed over them, familiar and comforting. But when they reached the vows, Vernon paused and looked at them both with eyes that had seen 70 years of human nature in all its complexity. Tobias and Grace have written their own promises to each other, he said. Words that speak to the unique nature of what they're building together. Tobias pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. He'd never been good with words, had spent most of his life letting actions speak louder. But Grace deserved words, deserved to hear what he was promising, even if he wasn't sure he could deliver it all. "Grace," he began, his voice rough but clear, "I can't promise I'll be perfect. I can't promise I won't make mistakes or let you down or struggle with the demons I carry. But I can promise I'll show up every day. I'll work hard to provide for you and these children. I'll be faithful and honest and try to be the man you saw in me that day at the auction when you decided we were worth saving." He paused, looking down at her belly where her own child grew. "I promise to love your baby like my own, to raise both children knowing they're wanted and valued. And I promise to spend the rest of my life earning the gift you're giving me today, the gift of a second chance." Grace's eyes glistened with tears, but she smiled as she squeezed his hands. "Tobias," she said, no paper needed, because she'd memorized the words while lying awake the night before. "I promise to be your partner in every sense, not just in raising these children, but in building the life we've chosen. I promise to respect you, to stand beside you when times are hard, and to remember that we're in this together." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I can't promise my heart will follow where my mind has led. I can't promise romantic love will bloom on command, but I can promise that I'll tend this marriage like a garden, with patience and care, and the faith that good things grow when you're willing to do the work. And I promise that whatever love I'm capable of giving, you and these children will have all of it." Vernon smiled, the expression of a man who just witnessed something rare and precious. "By the power vested in me by the state of West Virginia and the grace of Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife. Tobias, you may kiss your bride." Tobias leaned in carefully, as if Grace might break or disappear if he moved too fast. Their first kiss as husband and wife was gentle, chaste, the promise of something that might grow into more given time and patience. The small congregation applauded, and Lily chose that moment to let out a cry that echoed through the church, as if she wanted to make sure everyone knew she was part of this new family being formed. The reception was held at Wade Morrison's ranch, in the big barn that had been cleaned and decorated with more wildflowers and strings of lights that would glow when evening came. The whole county seemed to have shown up, bringing covered dishes and well wishes and curiosity in equal measure. Old Man Cooper, who'd lost his dairy farm to Gentry's schemes, pressed an envelope into Tobias's hand. "It's not much, but Martha and I wanted you to have it, for starting over on your family land." Inside was $50, a fortune for a man who'd lost everything and was now working factory jobs in Charleston. "I can't take this," Tobias protested. "You can, and you will," Cooper said firmly. "You stood up to Gentry, got the marshal involved. Because of you, I'm getting my farm back. We all are. That's worth more than money." Others came forward with similar gifts and stories. A woman whose husband's smithy had been stolen brought a set of hand-forged tools. A family who'd lost their general store brought canned goods and fabric. Each gift was small individually, but together they represented something larger: community, solidarity, the mountain way of taking care of your own. Grace stood beside Tobias through it all, her hand resting lightly on his arm, greeting guests and accepting congratulations with the gracious ease of someone who'd spent years as a teacher and librarian, dealing with all kinds of people. As the afternoon wore into evening, someone produced a fiddle, and soon music filled the barn.
Couples took to the makeshift dance floor, and Wade Morrison approached with his hand extended. "Mrs. McCoy," he said with exaggerated formality, "would you honor me with a dance? Your husband's got 2 left feet, but I figure you deserve at least 1 turn around the floor on your wedding day." Grace laughed and accepted, leaving Tobias holding Lily and watching his bride move gracefully, despite her pregnancy.
Ruth appeared at his elbow. "She's good for you," his mother said. "Better than you probably deserve, but that's how grace works. You don't earn it, you just accept it, and try to live worthy of the gift." Tobias looked down at his mother, noting the clarity in her eyes, the steady hands that had once shaken constantly from alcohol withdrawal. "How are you doing, really?" "Day by day," Ruth said honestly. "Had a moment of weakness Tuesday. Walked right up to Clancy's bar. Stood outside for 10 minutes trying to talk myself out of going in. Then I thought about Lily, about the promise I made to be her grandmother, and I walked away." "That took strength." "No, it took fear," Ruth corrected. "Fear of losing the one good thing I have left in this world. The chance to know my granddaughter." She reached out and gently touched Lily's cheek. "This baby saved my life. She doesn't even know it yet, but she did." The fiddle music changed tempo, and someone called for the bride and groom to take the floor. Tobias handed Lily to his mother and went to claim his wife from Wade's care. "I wasn't lying about the 2 left feet," Tobias warned, as Grace stepped into his arms. "Then we'll stumble together," Grace said. "Seems fitting for us anyway." They moved awkwardly at first, trying to find a rhythm that accommodated her belly and his nervousness. But gradually they settled into something that almost resembled a waltz, moving in slow circles while the fiddle played and their community watched. "Are you happy?" Grace asked quietly. Her voice meant only for him. Tobias thought about the question. Happy seemed too simple a word for what he felt. Relief that Lily was safe. Gratitude for Grace's impossible kindness. Hope that maybe he could build something good from the wreckage of his mistakes. And underneath it all, something warm and unfamiliar that might be the beginnings of love. "I'm getting there," he said. "Ask me again in a year." "I will," Grace promised. "And the year after that, and the year after that, until the answer is yes, without hesitation." As the evening wore on and the guests began to leave, Marshal Henry Dalton approached them with a folder under his arm. "Hate to interrupt the celebration," he said, "but I thought you'd want to know. Gentry's trial is set for October. Federal prosecutor says with the evidence we have, it's an open and shut case. He'll do time, probably 5 to 10 years in a federal prison." "And the properties?" Tobias asked. "All foreclosures executed with forged documents are void. Families can reclaim their land, though they'll need to settle any legitimate debts they owe. Your 80 acres is clean and clear. No liens, no encumbrances. It's yours, free and clear." Dalton pulled a document from his folder. "This is the deed, transferred back to your name. Congratulations, Mr. McCoy. You're a landowner again." Tobias took the paper with shaking hands, staring at the legal language that meant his children would grow up on family land, that 3 generations of McCoy history wouldn't end with Jonah's death and Gentry's greed. "Thank you, Marshal, for everything." "Thank Sheriff Burke, too," Dalton said. "He made mistakes, but when it counted, he chose truth over the paycheck Gentry was giving him. That took courage." After Dalton left, Grace and Tobias stood together in the barn doorway, watching the last guests depart. Lily had fallen asleep hours ago, and Ruth had taken her back to the farmhouse. The barn lights cast long shadows across the floor, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called out its lonely song. "What are you thinking?" Grace asked.
that 6 weeks ago I was standing at an auction, thinking I'd lost everything. Now I'm married to an incredible woman. I have my land back, and my daughter has a future." He turned to look at her.
"How did this happen?" "You decided to fight instead of giving up," Grace said. "And I decided to help instead of walking past. Everything else just followed from those two choices." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, before Grace spoke again. "When do you want to move to the homestead?" "Not until after your baby comes," Tobias said immediately. "Doctor says late December, early January. Moving a pregnant woman and an infant through winter mountain weather is asking for trouble. We'll stay at the farmhouse through the winter. Use that time to rebuild the cabin on the homestead, so it's ready when we move in spring." "That makes sense." Grace leaned against him, tired from the long day. "What will we do with the farmhouse?" "Keep it. It's your family land. Maybe Ruth could stay there, close enough to be part of Lily's life, but far enough that we all have our own space." Grace smiled. "You've been thinking about this." "Been thinking about a lot of things," Tobias admitted. "How to make this work. How to be the husband and father I need to be. How to deserve what you've given me." "Stop trying to deserve it," Grace said. "Just live it. Show up every day, do the work, and trust that the rest will follow." They walked back to the farmhouse as the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across the familiar landscape. Inside, they found Ruth asleep in the chair beside Lily's crib, one hand resting protectively on the baby's blanket. Tobias gently woke his mother and helped her to the guest room, then returned to find Grace standing in the doorway of what had been his room, but would now be theirs. "I know this isn't a traditional wedding night," Grace said quietly. "I'm 5 months pregnant with another man's child, exhausted, and my feet are swollen. Not exactly romantic." "I don't need romance," Tobias said. "I need to know you're all right, that you don't regret this." Grace crossed the room and took both his hands in hers. "I don't regret this. I'm terrified, because I've never done anything this unconventional in my life. But I don't regret it. Do you?" "No regrets," Tobias said. And as he said the words, he realized they were true. They lay down together for the first time as husband and wife. Grace on her side to accommodate her belly. Tobias curved behind her, with one arm draped protectively across her waist. It was intimate without being sexual, a closeness born of trust rather than passion. "Tell me about the homestead," Grace said sleepily. "What it looks like. What we'll build there." Tobias described the land he'd grown up on, painting pictures with words of the creek that ran clear and cold year-round, of the meadow where wildflowers bloomed every spring, of the stand of old-growth timber his grandfather had protected from logging, because he said some things were too beautiful to turn into money. He told her about his plans to rebuild the cabin bigger than before, with rooms for children and windows that caught the morning light, about terracing the hillside for a garden, and maybe keeping a few goats like his mother had when he was young. Grace fell asleep to the sound of his voice describing their future, and Tobias lay awake a while longer, listening to her breathe, feeling the slight movement of the baby in her belly against his hand. This was his family now, this woman who'd saved him, this child she carried, the daughter sleeping in the next room, and somewhere down the road, maybe more children, a house full of noise and love and the messy business of living. It wasn't the life he'd imagined. It was better, because it was built on truth and choice, and the kind of love that grows slow and deep, like oak roots in mountain soil. 2 months later, Grace woke Tobias in the middle of the night, her face pale but determined. "It's time," she said simply.
The baby came fast, entering the world with a cry that spoke of strength and stubbornness in equal measure. Dr. Harrison, who delivered half the babies in Harlow Springs over the past 30 years, placed the red-faced infant in Grace's arms. "It's a boy," he announced. "Healthy lungs on this one." Grace looked down at her son, then up at Tobias, who stood beside the bed with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thomas James McCoy," she said, "for the two good men in my life." Tobias reached out with one finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The infant grasped it immediately, holding tight with the grip of someone who'd just decided this world was worth being born into. In the next room, Ruth was rocking Lily, who'd woken to the commotion. The old woman sang softly in Cherokee, the same lullaby Naomi had taught her, passing down heritage and hope to the next generation. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose, a new family took its first breath together. A mountain man who'd lost everything and found something better. A widow who'd chosen hope over grief. Two babies who didn't care about the complicated circumstances of their births, only that they were loved and wanted. It wasn't a fairy tale. Real life never is. There would be hard days ahead, moments of doubt and struggle, times when the weight of their choices felt too heavy to carry. But they would carry it together. And in the mountains of West Virginia, where life came hard and love came harder, that was more than enough. Sometimes redemption looks like a second chance. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness. And sometimes it looks like a pregnant widow bidding $300 at an auction for a mountain man and his baby, then building a family from the broken pieces they brought each other.
Grace and Tobias McCoy would spend the next 40 years on that land, raising Lily and Thomas and 3 more children who came after. They would weather depressions and wars, joys and sorrows, the full measure of what life offers those brave enough to face it together. And when people asked them about their unusual beginning, about the auction and the scandal, and the choices that seemed so reckless at the time, they always gave the same answer. "We found each other when we were both broken, built something whole from the pieces. That's all." In the end, that's all any marriage is. Two people choosing each other, day after day, year after year, building something that outlasts them both and leaves the world a little better than they found it. That summer of 1924, in a small mountain town in West Virginia, a family was born. Not from romance or passion, but from something deeper and more lasting. From grace and grit and the stubborn mountain faith that broken things can be made whole if you're willing to do the work. They did the work, and the family they built stood for generations. The end.